so encompassing word, so it actually is quite difficult to define it as one word. But as you can see, it includes all these components of relation, actually child rearing methods, like jokes and artistic expressions. It's just very, very wide. But I think it'd be very good for you guys to remember that it encompasses not only the external stuffs that are seen, like a lot of customs or a lot of religious rituals, but also inner values. And then as you can see from the definition, it's a shared identity and values something that we have in common as a people. And last week, when we were talking about the definition of the communication, it basically means making things or finding things in common. And communication is related with the culture in the sense that culture actually defines people as being shared in identity, values, and beliefs. So, finding out those inner values, which are not seen, invisible, but also how those inner values affect external, like customs or rituals or the systems and institutions that we live in. That's going to be the caveat to understand what culture is and how it affects the way we live. All right, let's go into deeper on the definition of culture. Who's next? Okay, Claire.
Defining culture. Scholars from various disciplines, including philosophy, anthropology, cultural studies, and communication, have attempted to define culture.
Right.
Antonio Gramsci sees culture as a creative meaning-making process, constantly produced and reproduced by multiple groups, helping people make sense of their social world.
Right.
Clifford Geertz defines culture as a web spun by people, emphasizing it as a fabric of meanings that interprets human experience and guides actions.
Right.
Raymond Williams argues that culture is the product of individuals' whole committed personal and social experience, reflecting the meaning of a whole people.
Right.
Rogers and Steinfeld define culture as the total way of life of a people composed of learned and shared behavior patterns, values, norms, and material objects.
Right, so we have various scholars giving different versions of definitions on the culture, but then as you can see, they actually have some elements in common. So what are the elements in common? We have some words like meaning, sense-making, human experience, what else? Like norms, values. So, so as you can see from the common sort of shared meaning of the definitions offered by all these various scholars, we can say that culture is a shared meaning making. So when we say, okay, we try to see all this, like we have different dances, different languages, arts and crafts, literature, like food, fashion, all these elements, they compose what culture is. But then if you're trying to see why they are created as the culture sort of expressions, we have to see what's inside, what actually people are thinking about those stuff inside, and that's what it means by meaning making. So people are trying to create some meanings out of the world they live, out of all the things that they do, and they try to sort of create a common meaning that they can share with the people in the same community or in the same nationality or in the same region. So when people think about culture, we tend to think about the external stuff only. We think about what kind of food we eat. I was just talking with Andrea about the fashion or about the food and about what people traveling and arts and crafts, all this kind of stuff. But then what define them or what make them are actually what's inside the iceberg. These are only the tips of the iceberg of the culture, what constitutes culture. So if you want to see what deep culture is, then you really have to see what people think about those elements inside. And those elements, inner elements, actually include communication styles. So So we actually talk about, like high context and low context sort of cultures, and we talk about like polychronic, like monochronic sort of cultures. So people have different sort of communication styles. I mean, like Western people, I mean, we can't really generalize, but then on average, Western people, American people especially, they tend to be more direct. Whereas like people in Korea, we tend to be very formal, so all these like different communication styles and facial expressions and, like non-verbal cues. And then also, I think these are the most important stuff. So people have notions about like manner, leadership, like what it means by beauty, and they also have the concepts on the time frame, and what it means by justice and fairness, all this kind of stuff. They actually get together as to compose the cultural elements outside. And also the attitudes towards like the people, the elderly people, older children, or attitudes towards our work ethic is very important component. And also like death, life and death, all these like deep questions, they actually are interrelated with the meaning making, sense making. Why are we here? Why are we born in this nation? Why are we born in this country or like in this culture? So how do I have to behave, and what's the right way to interact with the people? And all these questions, actually they're deeply rooted onto these concepts, onto this the attitudes, and then they actually are forming towards what's outside. But we're going to actually delve into deep of the definition by looking at these circles. Okay? Next.
The inner core of culture includes history, identity, belief, values, and world views of a cultural group.
Right.
Every culture has a history that records and expresses its heritage through totems, archives, architectures, ancient languages, and paintings.
Right.
Culture is passed on from generation to generation, binding members together and providing a sense of identity. Identity encompasses various facets such as ethnic, national, gender, racial, social, corporate, professional, and sexual identities. Daily life involves negotiating and experiencing a spectrum of identities, each influencing how individuals view the world.
Right.
The term identity primarily refers to a person's subjective experience of themselves in relation to the world, a tactive, engaging part of one's being to identify with a certain group.
Right.
Culture is captured for individuals through beliefs and values, with each culture offering a unique window through which its members perceive reality.
Right. So when we think about culture, we tend to think about the cultural sort of activities or the customs, which is sort of in the middle side. So we think about like rituals, like religious rituals, or like cultural rituals, or like we think about like communication sort of styles, or like artistic expressions, or like I don't know, like holidays, those norms. But then actually what constitutes those cultural activities are what's inside, in our thoughts. And the core of culture is basically identity. What defines me as I am? Who am I in relation to the town or the people that surround me, or in relation to my nation. I really like this expression. It's the expression commonly used in sociology. One of the scholars actually defines a nation state. What do you mean by nation? Korea is a nation state as a imagined community. So for me, like when I had a PhD sort of defense of my thesis, I had to defend why Korea has the history of 5,000 years old. I learned it in my textbook when I was, I think it was when I was in primary school or secondary school. You guys learned in your textbook that Korea has the 5,000년, like 5,000 history, 5,000 years of history. And basically, one of the professors says, no, that's not the case. Because the Chinese argued that Korea was part of them, was China. And we Koreans argued that Japan was part of us, So all these different countries have different versions of their history. So basically, I had to give my argument why I think Korea has 5,000 years of history, And people might think that North Korea is a different country from South Korea because we have a different nation state. So why do we still think that North Korea is a part of Korean culture? I mean, we've been divided more than 70, how many years? More than 70 years. And I haven't even met any of the North Koreans before. But why do I still think that they are part of our culture or part of our nation, Although I haven't really had any physical touch with them. So maybe for me, Japanese might feel more similar. When I talk with the Japanese friends of mine, I just feel more comfortable talking with them. And I haven't ever met any of the North Korean people before. So how do you actually say to me that we are of the same culture? So a lot of scholars, they argue that culture or the nation state is an imagined community. It's made out of the version of history that's been created by a group of people. So if you want to understand the culture or the identity of a nation, what's most important as a nation state is the history. And the history is basically, what is it? Is it an objective? It's his story. A feminist would argue, why not her story? But it's his story. So it's a story. So people have different versions of stories, right? You have a different version of story about, maybe about Asia and Asia as a whole. Koreans have a different version of story, history about Asia, and Thai people might have a different version. I know that India and Pakistan, they have very different versions of their history in the region. So if you were to define a nation state as one culture, then what is the most important element of it is history. So that's why we have a history wall. And I think this is very prevalent in Europe. Because Europe has been sort of formed by different kinds of people, but then they're all intermixed. So I have a friend who lives in Geneva, and she actually lives in the border sort of land, a town which borders Geneva and France. And the people living there, they think themselves as French, although their citizenship might be Swiss, because most of their family members are from France, and they speak the language, they speak French language. And even doing the grocery, they actually go to the French stores because it's a lot cheaper than to buy the groceries from the French side and then the Swiss side because of the currency difference and everything. So for the Europeans, because their family members have been traveling and they've been moving around so much across the European borders, so for them, their versions of history is very sort of mixed, So if they were to talk with their French friends or French professors, they might have a completely different versions of history about the European continent than those from England or from Germany. And it's the same with us, Japanese, Chinese, and Koreans, and a lot of you guys from Asia. You guys all have different versions of history. And why do we have history wars? Is because that defines a nation state and that defines a culture. And so that's what's going on the macro sort of scale. But if it goes down into the individual state level, then history defines our identity. I told you that because I lived abroad so much, I was sort of like a sojourner. I don't know whether you still remember that word, sojourner. I traveled so much. So although citizenship-wise I'm Korean, I feel like I'm a cosmopolitan. What do you mean by cosmopolitan? I can talk with a lot of Europeans. I just feel really comfortable talking with the Europeans because I lived there for like 10 years, you know, like, so for me, my, I don't know, like my academic and intellectual language is English, and I had that cultural understanding and a communication sort of is a lot easier for me because I spend my, I don't know, like very important years of my life in Europe. So somehow my identity has been formed out of my experiences, and I've learned so much about the European history. So somehow my understanding of the world comes from the side, you know. So if you want to understand the culture, you don't think of it as an objective sort of factual stuff as you would read any of the textbooks or the books. You always have to think about it as a dynamic or like fluctuation. You know, when you actually go across different borders and different cultures, your identity might become very different. And that's why understanding different cultures or the different belief systems and the value systems, which affect your worldview. What do you mean by worldview? How you view the world around you. You know, it's not only about the world that you live in, like that you can physically see, but a lot of the news that you see in the media, you know, you analyze and you evaluate those news out of your worldview. So all this like history, identity, your beliefs and values, which have been implanted onto you through all this education and experiences that you've had so far, you know, that determines your worldview. And that determines the inner core of the culture. So culture is a very fluid and very flexible, sort of fluctuating term because it's very subjective. And even the history is just it's a story, you know, so you have to think hard what version of history you have. All right, so that's what defines the inner core of the culture. And then on the outer layer, the intermediate layer, this is sort of what we think of culture most of the time. So let's have a look. What's in the intermediate layer of a culture?
The intermediate layer of culture is connected to the inner core, but has more capacity to change. This layer consists of cultural activities expressed through technology, material objects, rules, rituals, customs, communication patterns, and artistic expressions.
Right.
Rituals, customs, and festivals reflect culture, such as the celebration of Queen's Day in the Netherlands or the significance of football in many countries. Relationship in a cultural context generate dynamic roles and expectations defined by cultural norms.
Right.
Behavior norms associated with rules, norms, customs, and rituals are shaped by culture, influencing communication patterns.
Right.
Communication behaviors such as turn-taking, gestures, loudness, directness, and late are expected to conform to a culture's norms.
Right.
Cultural differences in communication behaviors, both verbal and non-verbal, contribute to intercultural misunderstandings.
Right.
Both verbal and non-verbal communication behaviors are integral to culture, representing a way of living and a whole social process. The intermediate level of culture reflects social and cultural rules along with communication patterns.
Right. So I think it was the last time when we were talking about the different like communication styles. The Western people or the American people tend to be more direct, and they're very punctual, whereas like the people from Saudi Arabia, they have a different sets of standards applied for like different times. You know, when the person in the top in the hierarchy says, you know, I'm gonna be like half an hour late, it is okay. It's accepted by their cultural norms. And there are all these like hidden rules that you have to follow, which are not very overt. So you basically have to decipher what those inner sort of customs are. And I mean, when we're, I think it was in the last semester, we were talking about the human rights, the meaning of human rights. The human rights as a concept has become very prevalent across the globe. So people think everybody has a human rights. This is sort of like a norm across most of the country nowadays, but it was not the case even like 60 years ago. This is a recent phenomenon. So like after World War II, we had these international conventions basically saying everybody has a human right and everybody has this inherent right which has to be respected of. And we learned in our course that concept of human rights came from this concept of natural rights, which a lot of English philosophers developed during 18th and early 19th century. And what do you mean by natural rights? Basically, it says, regardless of the environments or external circumstances, doesn't matter, every human being, for that it was only the European male at the time, because they only considered the European male as a human being at the time, but at least for them, every European human being, every human being has a right to be respected regardless of the circumstances or the environments that they are born with. This is a God-given sort of quality or respect. So this concept of natural rights had been developed in European sort of countries, and then that sort of affected the U.S. and it's been included in the constitutions of the U.S. And then it's actually become very internationalized with the UN, establishment of the UN and all these conventions that followed afterwards, right? So it's all, and that's why in a lot of European countries or a lot of US, especially in the American culture, this concept of individualism is very important. It's inherent in their value system. Because this, for example, US, its constitution basically has this clause on the natural rights of the human being. That sort of means what it means by a US citizen, and all the citizens in the US, they have a natural right to be respected. So they have all these rights for freedom of speech right, and convention, freedom to convene, all these rights guaranteed, property rights, and it's basically all these values. They are the foundational blocks, and then it affects the culture, and that's why the American culture, they have a very direct and sort of individualistic communication style, because for them, one person, like one human being, equals the whole sort of has the inherent essential right, and that's why we have to put a lot of emphasis. We have to put a lot of importance on one individual. So whether he's from a rich family or powerful family, from a powerful position, that doesn't really matter. That person and the other person has one equal right, and that's why they can have an equal sort of communication. And when this person says 1 o'clock, this is 1 o'clock for him, regardless of he's from a wealthy family or the powerful position. So that's why communication tends to be very direct. So you can see their beliefs, values, all these philosophical backgrounds, they affect the what's going on in the intermediate sort of sphere. Communication, rituals and customs. So that's why it's very important to what's inside the history, identity, and beliefs and values and worldviews of this one country or of this one group. Okay, so what's on the outer side? Okay, who's next?
The outer layer of culture. The outer layer of culture involves cultural institutions, which are tied to inner core and allow the flexibility and change. Institutions include formalized systems such as religion, economy, politics, family, healthcare, and education.
Right.
Religion encompasses systems of thought providing answers to life's big questions and involves belief, ceremonies, worship, norms of respect, and spiritual issues.
Right.
The economic system reflects cultural influences with variation in business transaction, like barter trade in remote village or cash and credit cards in more developed regions.
Right.
Culture systems, including religion, festivals, events, healthcare practice, and educational systems, reveal important aspects of a group or nation's culture.
Right.
The outer layer of cultural systems is fundamental to culture's economic, legal, social, and spiritual nature, contributing to its ultimate survival.
Right. So you actually think that culture embraces everything. It not only embraces like we don't really have a culture, we don't really call it culture system, but within the outer sphere, we have a religious system, we have educational system, we have political system, economic system, kinship, like family sort of system, and health system. So actually, culture encompasses everything that you can think of. You know, every kind of institutions and like systems, and this is very revealing. So I was talking with my doctor friend, and we're talking because I'm an education scholar. So we're talking about the education systems. And we have of course, doctors strike these days, so we have some problem, some crisis within the medical system in Korea nowadays. So we're having a debate and we're having discussions, and he pointed out that a lot of the medical system of South Korea came from the Japanese system. And I was thinking, when we were liberated from Japan, our education system followed the structure of the US system. So that's why we have like 6 years of primary and like 3 years of middle school, like 3 years of high school, and then 4 years of college. This is an American structure. So I was thinking, I thought our education system followed the Americans, but he said no. The culture aspect of our medical sort of system, and medical school, we just inherited the Japanese heritage of the colonial era. And that's why we basically don't really have a free flow of conversation. So say in the States, if you have a problem, then regardless of your seniority, you basically talk directly. But in Korea, because we were just so much like tied down to the culture of the Japanese sort of colonial era, so there's this really severe hierarchy. And you basically have to do whatever your senior says. And that's why they don't really have a constructive sort of feedback or constructive criticism. And that's why we have this crisis as of now. So he was basically criticizing how the cultural elements within a system affect so much more than we could have actually think of, So the culture is a lot more important than system. So what this diagram means, so the culture, it starts from this very like foundational sort of values within oneself, as well as in a country's history, values, and beliefs and worldview, and it expands to sort of these activities, but it affects the whole system of the country. So if you were to understand the system only as a system per se, then you only have a surface sort of understanding. So you really have to go into the culture of that system, be that like medical system, education system, or the financial system. You have to go into deep down as to see what culture we have and how we can make a change out of it. Okay, so who's next?
Culture is holistic and long.
Right.
Culture functions as an integrated and complex whole with interrelated components. Exploring specific cultural formations reveals the interconnectedness of cultural elements.
Right.
Shields,
Bert.
vocals,
Yeah, that's a difficult name to pronounce.
emphasize that individuals carry vectors of thinking, feeling, and potential acting on throughout their lifetime, with much of it occurred in early childhood. Culture learning is a continuous process, and individuals constantly learn specific rules and norms governing their behaviors within their communities. Cultural rules are learned from various sources, including family, plans, teachers, proverbs, adages, and folktales, and their effects may become apparent when encountering different cultural practice.
Right, and this culture, because it comes from this all this like foundational inherent values, you know, you actually learn to cultivate your culture from the early on, as soon as you're born. You know, but by the way people actually smile at you, you know, how you are actually tamed, you know, whenever you cry, you know, there are certain actions that your parents do. Maybe it's for some families, the parents are very sort of adamant, and you know, so they try to discipline their children. You know, whereas like my family, we're very laissez-faire, so we try to accommodate our children's, you know, feelings or like whatever as much as possible. So different families have different cultures, and different sort of nation states have different cultures. So and the cultural elements, they're constantly changing, but also being learned by the members of the society, on and on and on. So the culture is very like dynamic, is holistic, and is changing all the time, and it's being learned by the member of the society. Also, the people who are coming into the system or the nation state, you know, they're constantly learning about the new elements of the culture. So it's actually, I like to talk about different cultures because, you know, they're always changing, and they're always like something new to learn. All right, and we have subcultures. Who's next?
Subcultures: ethnic, social, organizational, and regional culture.
Right.
Ethnicity often forms the basis of subculture within larger national cultures. Ethnic groups are identifiable bodies with common heritage and cultural tradition passed down through generations.
Right.
Socioeconomic status, SES, can serve as the basis for a subculture. SES is derived from factors such as income, education, occupation, residential area, and family background.
Right.
Subcultures encompass organizational cultures within different companies. Organizational cultures include distinct way of doing things and communicating within a specific organization.
Right.
Geographic regions serve as a basis for categorizing people into different cultural groups. Regional differences often imply variation in social attitudes, lifestyle, food preference, and communication.
Right. But we also have a lot of subcultures. Jeonbukdae is a kind of subculture. You have your own culture here, right? And within Jeonbukdae, you know, you have international studies subculture. I guess you guys, your culture is a bit different from a lot of other departments. You know, people at a lot of other departments. For a nation state, ethnicity is an important subculture. I mean, Korea is pretty homogeneous sort of society, so we don't have as many like ethnic diversity. But in the U.S., you know, which ethnic group you belong to, that's a huge factor that determines actually your life, right? But then I think in Korea, socioeconomic status, I think it's a more determining sort of subculture that defines the identity of people. So where you live, you know, how much income do you earn, what kind of job you have, that sort of those elements determine the SES, socioeconomic sort of factor. And a lot of studies actually in Korea, like in sociology, education, in a lot of social science fields are done based on the socioeconomic status. And I think it's partly because, you know, Korea doesn't really have a lot of ethnic sort of diversity. So what people actually differentiate themselves with are a lot of cases based on the socioeconomic status. And you know, subcultures also include organizational cultures. So if you were to work in like Samsung, they have this expression called Samsung Men, you know, because they have their own subculture within the company. I've never worked at Samsung, so I don't know what the Samsung sort of culture looks like. But I guess it's very like sort of punctual, like a very diligent, and you know, like there are a lot. I mean, they're trying to emphasize a lot of innovation, but I don't know how they are trying to create the culture of innovation nowadays. But if you were to work in the government, that subculture is very different from, say, you're working at an academia or a creative agency. So what kind of organization you belong to, or what kind of jobs or what kind of career you belong to, that sort of determines what kind of subcultures that you will actually belong to and then be formed as out of it. For me, like I'm not a very sort of academic person. I mean, as you can see, like I'm not very like stern. A lot of professors are like, but I'm not like that because like I haven't really worked in academic. I don't really like that academic culture. I like more like interactional sort of casual conversations that I can have with the people. So I guess which sort of organization or which profession you belong to, that sort of determines a part of your identity and your culture as well. And in Korea especially, I feel that there is a huge difference according to generation. So we have a generational subculture. You guys are very different from my generation. And I'm in my 40s. You guys are like in your 10th. Who's 19 here? Nobody 19? Oh, you're 19. Okay. So you guys are like millennials, right? Some of you guys were born after like 2000, right? Yeah, it's Gen Z. It's like so different from a lot of the old Koreans. So you have your own subculture, which is very different from the older generation in Korea. And I feel that since we are living in a globalized world, I feel that you actually tend to have a lot more common with the people in your generation. So it sort of overcomes the national sort of differences. So say I was like talking with some of my friends from China. I mean, like I'm a lot older than you. I'm like more than like 20 years old. So when I lived in UK, that was like 20 years ago, and I started speaking with my Chinese friend. And at that time, China, is a capitalistic sort of country nowadays, but at that time it wasn't really open at that much, So I was actually thinking, oh, it's a communist country. I haven't really met anyone, so maybe she's very different from what so what kind of things that can we talk in common? But I actually realized that she's so much more in common with me than a lot of the other people, because we're sort of from the same culture, but in the same generation, and also socioeconomic status was sort of similar. Her parents and my parents have sort of similar jobs, and we had a lot of things in common that we could talk to. So this really means, don't think of your identity bounded by a national culture. You can actually find a lot more in common according to what subcultures you belong to, and that subcultures are from like many different factors. So you can actually find the common subcultures that you share with others, and you can start a conversation out of it. All right, who's next?
Understanding cultural differences in communication.
Right.
Research the culture, learn about the customs, beliefs, and the values of the person's culture.
Right.
Be aware of the non-verbal cues. Recognize that the non-verbal cues can differ across the cultures. Understand cultural values. Recognize that the cultural values influence communication styles. Be mindful of the language barriers. Avoid using idioms and jargon, and speak slowly and clearly if you need it. Avoid making assumptions. Approach communication with an open mind and respect for the different cultures.
So if you were to have a very effective intercultural communication, I think this is very important. Research the culture. A lot of people think that like, we're culturally very different, so maybe it'd be very difficult to have a business or like to communicate, but it's not the case if you were to research enough, and this is something that we're doing here. I mean, we're trying to experience as many like possible scenarios as possible in terms of like intercultural communication. So we'll get into the details of like how different sort of countries have different customs or like different manners of speaking or different communication styles, and that can actually set you a background about in which that you employ different sort of communication styles, and also, I mean, of course, we would have a language barrier, but I guess the most important thing is not to try to make too much assumption. I think people assume too much about the differences, but the point is, by doing some significant research about the other culture, about the other person, and exposing yourself to different environments and different people, you actually try to overcome the pre-held assumptions about the other cultures or about the other countries. So this is the whole point of this communication class. All right, so this is the end of my lecture. We're going to do some exercise for the intercultural communication. So I have one of these. Oh, let me have just one. Turn to page 53, which is on the 53. Make sure that you have one copy. Does everybody have one copy? Everyone? All right, let's turn to page 53. And it basically explains 3 different types of cultures. I think we covered the high context and low context cultures, and monochronic and polychronic time culture. I'm sorry. Okay, so you need these 3 standards or 3 criteria for you to have a discussion on given scenarios. So we've covered about the differences between high context and low context cultures, and monochronic and polychronic time. We've covered both of them, so you can actually just read them to recap. The first one, external and internal culture. This is something that we've discussed today, but just to recap, we're just going to read it. Who's next?
Research the culture. Learn about the customs, beliefs, and values of the person's culture. Be aware of...
Are you reading 53? 53. Page 53. On the second paragraph, external and internal culture.
Whether a culture is national or organizational, it is important to be aware of the meaning that lies beneath observer behavior.
Right. External culture?
External culture can be studied in history, geography, political science, and the arts. Understanding external objective aspects of a culture can foster greater understanding.
Right.
Internal culture is culture implicitly learned. Internal culture includes subjective knowledge that is unconsciously held, including shared values, beliefs, assumptions, and behaviors. Internal aspects of culture cause the greatest misunderstandings in cross-cultural encounters.
Right. So external cultures, this is what I have explained, like history. If you want to, learn about the history, then you can read a lot of history books. Geography, like social sciences, arts, these are like seen. These are visible. So you can actually learn about them by reading a lot of materials or just studying like different sources. But then internal culture, this is something that you really have to learn out of the interactions and communications. And how can you do it? By interacting a lot. So that's, I mean, this is something that you can only learn by experience. And that's why it's so much important that you have a physical, face-to-face meeting with people from different cultures. Otherwise, these internal cultures, you would never be able to uncover, right? So that's why we do all these exercises as well. You know, like this is to help you realize, you know, like those like non-verbal cues, you know, like how people behave in like this kind of situation and that kind of situation. Like for example, in UK, people always cue. You know, so if you were to cut the line, then it's like a grave sin, you know. So if any people like spot you cutting the line, then it's like, I don't know, like you're actually making a serious crime or something. You know, it's that grave in the UK. But you would never know. Nobody actually tells me about that before I went to UK. You know, I just learned it by living there. So all these internal like rules and regulations or like the customs, you can only learn as you live or as you interact with the people inside, right? So we have these 3 criteria explained, okay? And let's go to the last page, which says cultural scenarios. How many paragraphs do we have? We have 5 paragraphs, okay? And 1 paragraph basically indicates 1 scenario. So the first scenario, the story basically, you're German working in a multicultural team in Belgium. So this is giving you a scenario where you basically, most of them are in the business sort of settings, and you are giving a role of a person living and working in this specific culture. And how would you actually overcome the intercultural, multicultural frictions, you know? So there is actually this is an exercise that puts you in the hands or the shoes of this person working in the intercultural environment, and basically you have to become a German working in this intercultural, multicultural company in Belgium. And how would you actually resolve the conflicts that arise out of it, you know? So it's giving 5 scenarios